So in other podcasts, I've talked about the distinction between thinkers and doers, which, obviously has a certain legitimacy, at least a certain taxonomic legitimacy, whether it actually corresponds to some fundamental structural distinction is another matter. But I also said, and this is again another sort of superficially reasonable point, that it may be true, but I also said, well, unless somebody has some intelligence, I said that, a person can be intellectual but not smart, which is true. But then I also said, but when somebody who is intellectual is not smart, it's not a very stable configuration. I don't know if that second point is really correct, and here's why I say this. And again, this is something that I talked about in another podcast, but I'll just repeat myself. I'll repeat what I said there. So, people talk about how, liberalism has done all this damage, and it has, but it has not done damage for the reasons that people think. It's not that liberal values are bad. They're fine, right? It doesn't matter whether they're good or bad. Their values are, as long as somebody actually has values, literally actually has them, not faux values, but actually has values. It doesn't matter that much what those values are, as long as they really are values. But here's the thing, which is that a kind of side effect of liberalism, or maybe it's really part of the package, but okay, so, you have these various views, about relations between men and women. Maybe those views are true, maybe they're not. Okay, fine. Who cares? But here's what the real, and maybe those views are rightly conceived, maybe they're not, but that's not all that important. Here's what is important, and and it's the thing that did the damage, which is that after liberalism, the liberalism hydrogen bomb dropped on all of us in the 60s, it became about having the right views. In other words, basically what happened is that the 60s came along, and then people started to judge themselves. People started to self-conceive as thinkers. It became about having the right beliefs. An intellectual is somebody for whom it is very important to have correct or otherwise meritorious views. An intellectual is somebody who prides himself on his sagacity, on his clarity and depth of thought. He is somebody who prides himself on having intelligent beliefs, on seeing things as they are. Okay? Not all people pride themselves on that. Some people pride themselves on their ability to get things done. Okay? They're not all that concerned, with how nuanced or high resolution or wonderful their mental representations of reality are. They're concerned with those things to the extent that, being able to get things done involves seeing things as they are, but they're more concerned with other things. And some people might be concerned with relationships but what happened is in the 60s, this liberalism came along, and then it became about having the right views. And the identity of those views is secondary. But what is not secondary, what is primary, is that so all of these people many of whom would otherwise have been doers or feelers or this or that, they all ended up being intellectuals, but not intelligent intellectuals. Some did, but the percentage of people who could actually make a go of being intellectual did not increase, but the number of people who were, in fact, ended up becoming intellectual did increase just dramatically. It increased from, around 2% or less than 1% actually of the population to around 85%. And at the same time, the number of, but the percentage of people who would actually make good intellectuals did not increase. So you end up with all these half-baked dipshits, right? And that's why a lot of the and I think this actually kind of fed back into the liberalism. So you started off with okay, so there was the kind of Jeffersonian liberalism, which is just wonderful. It has limitations, okay, but it certainly is to be taken very seriously and certainly has its virtues in some context. Okay, then there was a kind of Marxist kind of perversion of it. Okay, fine, whatever. All right, but then what happens is, okay, fine. So maybe Marx's line of goods is a bit rancid. Okay, but that's in and of itself is not the end of the world. But then what ended up happening was that you had a lot of people who previously would have been, mechanics or innkeepers, or they would have been doers of some kind, and they ended up then because it became about having the right beliefs. So all these people who were non-thinkers ended up being thinkers, but just very, very, very bad ones. And when that happens, when somebody who is not a thinker is forced to become a thinker, he is very, 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 he ends up going in there are only a few directions he can go in. Okay, one is, well, actually, no, I was going to say one is just the direction of kind of extreme fanaticism, the kind of proverbial evangelical Christian, but those people do not self-identify as thinkers. It's a different thing. Actually, no, there aren't too many directions that a sort of manqué intellectual can go in. And what they end up doing, because they're stupid, is they end up embracing basically skepticism and relativism, because those are positions that you can use those positions simply to silence people. And they're non-positions, just a way of saying that there's nothing to know. So I'm not actually that dumb. Because, as soon as somebody whips out the ruler with respect to which, their sagging intellect would otherwise be measured and found to fall desperately short, they can just say, oh, well, it's the ruler that's bent, not my limp intellect. Okay, so they ended up, and then this sort of relativism and nihilism and these various kind of, postmodernist Wittgensteinianisms, these faux intellectual positions. So then what ends up happening is, because you have, all of these people who would otherwise have been sort of okay had they not been forced to become intellectuals, but now you have this population of convenience store intellectuals who are stupid, right? And then, they end up embracing these invariably kind of inevitably nihilistic and sterile positions like skepticism and relativism, and then that ends up feeding back into the original set of values that liberal or quasi-liberal set of values that they were asked to embrace in the first place, and it ends up kind of warping those, and maybe it ends up radicalizing that which was already bad in those set of values. And not everything was bad in those set of values. I mean, the 50s were not that great. And, there were good things about the 60s. There were some very bad things. There were some very superficial things. Superficiality was worse than the badness. But so that is what ends up happening. So we actually do have a population of because let's face it, I mean, even when I was a kid, which I'm 44, but I do remember, there were people who were tough. I mean, there were people who were doers. They were not people who, these were normal people these were people who self-identified not as philosophers, but as tough guys who get things done, and that's pretty much gone. So now you basically have two kinds of people. You seem to have stupid intellectuals, and then you have this tiny little crust of actual intellectuals. So that, I think, the damage done by liberalism does not lie in the specific identities of the values that you were asked to accept. It lies in the fact that because of it, it became about whether you had the right values, as opposed to some other thing. I mean, in the past, it was not about whether you had the right values. It was about whether you could get things done, or there were a lot of different benchmarks. It was not about whether you had the right thoughts. And then it became about whether you had the right thoughts. Now, it may well be that the thoughts liberalism wants you to have are the right ones, but the very fact that it is now all about whether you have those thoughts means that you have all of these stupids who are actually now intellectuals, because an intellectual is not somebody who's smart. An intellectual is somebody who self-identifies or self-evaluates in terms of his ability to understand the world. So there it is.